institutionalization of innovation in U.S. city government, maximizing the utility of technology for problem solving. So I'll explain a little bit more about what that means. So just to start off, I want to explain what I mean throughout the entire presentation when I say the word innovation. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people, but in this context, I'm talking about specifically the use of digital technology to come up with creative problem solving for urban issues. So specifically as it relates to urban planning. So generally when we talk about innovation in this context, what are we talking about? What do we want from it? So some of the more general things are more efficient government, better communication, greater participation, et cetera, all those kinds of ideal things that we want out of urban planning. And how do we do that with innovation? Web platforms, communication technology, social media, big data, et cetera, et cetera. So what I've done is come up with three main categories of kind of the types of solutions that are being developed for urban spaces, and they fall under communication and participation, open data, and partnerships and collaboration. There's like a ton of things. Obviously, you could move stuff around within these two categories, but I think based on the research I've done, that these are the three primary categories. So what's historically happened is that the private sector has been responsible for the development of most of these types of innovative solutions that are urban issues. But more recently, city governments have begun to institutionalize these kinds of startups and university labs and things like that to develop these kinds of things. So you guys probably, everybody uses something that's been developed by the private sector for cities. Usually the most common one that people have on their phone is like apps that tell you when the bus is coming, when the train is coming. All of those kinds of things, 99% of the time, have not come from city government, they've come from the private sector. So what's my question? One, and this is something that I, as of 45 minutes ago, decided that maybe doesn't make that much sense, but number one is, why are city governments attempting to emulate these efforts if the private market, so to speak, is doing these things efficiently and well? Why are city governments trying to get involved? And two, which is a question that's kind of been changing as I've been talking to Super about, what are the metrics or benchmarks with which these city governments could measure the effectiveness of what they're doing in terms of the institutionalization of these innovation departments? And the question is, who cares? Why should anybody care about this? The kind of general answer is that there's a lot of opportunity for an increase in transparency. All of those things that I listed that we want out of innovation, you could get if you could maximize these kinds of departments. So the answer, who cares? Everybody. A big thing that happened recently was Bloomberg Philanthropies recently got $24 million. They basically invested in 5 or 6 cities, and they gave them a sum of money, and they just watched what they did with it. They watched what kind of innovation they attempted to do with that money over the course of a year. And that's actually an ongoing thing. And there have been a lot of questions and concerns about what the right balance is between having a smart city and just kind of throwing money and effort at something, and the rise of the municipal chief innovation officer, which is something that more and more cities are implementing. So how could you study this is where I've been having a bit of trouble keeping this a tractable question. So what I started out doing was I looked at the top 25 most populated US cities, which you have here, and then I looked at which of those cities had some form of innovation department, some form of institutionalized innovation department, which you see here. And then I chose 3 cities that fall under, that exemplify those 3 categories that I outlined at the beginning. And those are New York, Chicago, and Boston. So New York has kind of exemplified the efforts of communication and participation through their Department of Internet Technology. I can't remember the acronym right now. Chicago's focus is almost primarily on open data and giving out data to its constituents. And Boston, the Department of New Urban Mechanics, who work primarily, probably because they're in Boston, on fostering partnerships and collaboration between institutions within the city. So for New York, these are just comments from their websites or comments I've gotten from people I've spoken to. Engagement is one of their 4 tenets on a recent roadmap that they've put together. Chicago's is from their website, and the guy I spoke to, their data guy, who's basically their innovation guy, who basically said data is pretty much all that they are focusing on right now. And Boston through mechanics actually stays primarily for partnerships. So my methodology, this is where my question kind of fell apart a little bit, because the difficulty is essentially how you would measure effectiveness. So these departments that have come up in cities, I've spoken to both Boston and Chicago, and they have no real way of measuring how effective the effectiveness of what they're doing is. There's no way of measuring whether New York is better off in terms of participation than Charlotte is if Charlotte doesn't have a department like New York has. So what I wanted to do was compare maybe 3 cities that don't have these kinds of departments and 3 cities that do, Boston, Chicago, and New York, and come up with some kind of metric or benchmark with which I could compare that. But in thinking about how exactly you would do that, I've come into a bit of trouble, which I might ask for your help with. So I started talking to people. I mentioned earlier the Chief Innovation Officer. There's a lot of these people around now, and they kind of just are multiplying, but there are certain primary people that...
but one of them appears to be evil.
Yes, well, several of them are evil. I've spoken to a couple of them, and they're really interested in this because they themselves, I actually forgot to speak to the importance of this, but they themselves want to find a way to quantify what they're doing, because otherwise they're just going to lose what little money they're already receiving. So I've talked to some people. This is my last slide. It's fallen apart at this point, the methodology aspect of it, but hopefully you guys can help me a little bit.
Excellent. Anybody want to start out? And we know that some of these will fall very much in different reviewers' sort of review and others not.
Yeah.
But I think it's just healthy to get a lot of different minds on these topics. Yeah.
Because this is so not known. Could you put up one of the previous slides and you have your central, I think, 2 questions that you did?
Yeah.
I'm curious why you're situating it as a comparison against the private sector. Why not simplify the question and just say, why are cities doing this? As opposed to saying, what does it mean with respect to the private sector? Why not just say, why do cities want to do this? And why do different cities want to do this? And do they share motivations, or do they have different motivations? Like, it seems like it complicates things to say, like, putting everything in a comparative thing against what the private sector has done. Why not just say, the new thing is that cities want to do this. Why do they want to do it? And then that also, why necessarily have a formal evaluation criteria? Why not ask why they want to do it? Why do you have to? It seems like this is still the why rather than what stage. Like if they had lots of experience, then you could start to evaluate their success. But it seems like this is still at the stage of saying, this is really interesting. It's intriguing that so many city governments want to do it. Why are they actually trying to do this? Because they're trying to do it more than actually having had done it, right? So that just really simplifies the question, because then it's like, interesting. There's this interesting motivational question. Cities are getting into this whole new field. That's intriguing. You know, why do they want to get into this whole new area that maybe or maybe not they have some skills at, rather than couching it as an evaluation question or as a saying, given what the private sector has done, how will the public sector do?
That's something I was going to mention too. I agree that what's kind of curious about this, and I didn't realize this, so I'm glad you pointed it out, is that this runs somewhat contrary to a lot of discourse about the offloading of responsibility from both agencies and private sector. So I totally agree with you, but I think you need something up front that says, look, there is a fundamental paradigm shift here from a trajectory we've recognized over the last 10, 15 years, this offloading and downloading of responsibility. But this is kind of a counter move or something like that. So maybe I agree with Mike, but maybe something at the beginning, just because that just seems like this way. This is opposite of everything.
The direction.
I think that is so important, because that goes back to what conversation are you adding to? One of the conversations isn't maybe just this digital conversation, it's the conversation about what is the role of the government in design and in the city. And I think most people are saying the role of government in the city is getting less and less and less. That's kind of a philosophical position. This is very much running upstream, so that's interesting.
It could be a different project.
Yeah.
Not to throw it.
No, that's good. I need to register this.
I don't, excuse me. So I understand that you need to find a methodological way for finding this metric. This is a critical point. I think it's not easy because there are a lot of different data and different cities use these data in completely different ways. Right? So I think this is one critical point.
Yeah.
And related with the first question is so in which way cities use all this knowledge for making decisions? So what could change in the process of making decisions in cities when they have all this data or when they have all this digital instrument? And I think it's also a critical point because all this information is produced for something. So in which way the governance change when they know all this information? So the first question is why? Why? It's because they could change some processes perhaps, or they could be more involved in what's happening in the public opinion, or they could be more involved in the online processes of many things that happen online every day in the cities that you can metric and you can measure permanently.
You know, one of the things that I would be interested in is what ultimately could be a hypothesis of the difference between city government involvement versus city private.
I mean, I started out this idea as like, I had a very specific thing in mind that these efforts were, I was being cynical and that these efforts are just bright shiny objects that are to like as marketing tools for cities. But yeah, I mean, that's.
So maybe that's something that comes at the end, right? I think kind of starting off with what output is setting is really important.
Right.
And then at some point you may be able to assess that.
And that's interesting because it actually touches on Vanessa's point as well, where it goes back to why it goes back to sort of a hypothesis about why cities want to do this, and then also, what if they did do this, what would actually change, or what's sort of at stake? It goes back to the importance question, and maybe the importance is slightly bigger conceptually than the way you put it. Maybe much more kind of is at stake conceptually, given what Ina said, for example, about how could this data be used?
Yeah.
Not just sort of how it could change government, but how, if this were used in the way city governments are thinking, what would change, or what could change?
And also, I think the categories, that you identify, so you're going to basically focus on three. So one of my questions would be, first of all, for you, I guess, how did you come to those three categories?
Yeah.
But is there a certain reason that cities are particularly strong in those categories? Or why are they focusing on these categories?
We could see that in these categories.
Yeah. Those, these were meant to be kind of as broad as possible in the sense that they would pretty much encapsulate every other sub thing that a city could do. So to answer your question of why they're focusing on these, it's more that these are like the broadest possible ways of saying all of the things, like all of those things. So I mean,
Well, but it brings up the question. To me, I think one of the things that's not clear at this point is what are the problems?
Right.
This whole thing has an undercurrent of certain problems and creative solutions and creative responses to these things. But I'm not actually sure what the problems are. So, you're kind of implying that the problems are best solved through open data sources, communication, expression, and so on. But there's kind of a disconnect there. So I'm not really sure what it means. Is it the smart cities thing? Are we talking about smart power grids and feedback and all that stuff? Are we talking about community participation models?
Well, I think that's
collection of data.
Right.
Data, in source form.
that speaks to, I think, partly to the tractability issue of this idea. This is like every urban problem ever, everything, which maybe is the reason to kind of calm down a bit and want to talk about it.
I really like the initial idea, well, not because I said it, but reading into what you put
Right.
up here. I like your identification of the public-private thing.
Yeah.
It brings up the cases too,
Yeah.
which is that there are three fairly consistent North American cases of corruption. But, if you look at welfare states, if you look at Sweden, than all of us, but if you look at those areas, that there's a very different political system in place.
Right.
And that impacts the public sector's role in those decisions. So I wonder if that opens it up too.
This is really, I think, such an interesting point, right? Because every case is taken so many different ways. Part of it is what conversation you want to contribute to, right? Is yours a much more pragmatic effort to advance the cause? Because when you start talking about evaluation, in a way, it sort of seems like how can you improve this effort? In some ways. Whereas Jason's sort of maybe taking a much more sort of skeptical position that takes a much more politically informed position and says, given the general trajectory, speaking to a much more broad conversation about the role of the state, the role of city government. But in a way, it depends on you. Where do you want to sort of make your mark, right? But I think that's a really interesting element that I don't think we've spoken about. That would be, I think you should definitely address, right? Because this does represent a bit of a departure, it seems.
Charles Walnut says this all the time. What party do you want to join? What party do you want to be at? Who do you want to hang out with?
That's the driving force behind this whole thing. What do I know?
We got to pick a party.
Anybody else? I think this is really helpful, but I think the methodology part, one thing I would just say, which is relevant for everybody, 5 or 6 times you mentioned that your question had fallen apart. Don't. Just advance your claim and let its sort of rigor stand for itself. Because people don't need any sort of primes that it's not as rigorous as they would have. But the methodology part is also interesting. I mean, how will you identify interviewees? And you can sort of see that all of these elements are connected, right? The question, the conversation you want to contribute to, then the methodology you choose. There's this kind of articulation of all three. But until you get that question totally defined, it's hard to know methodologically how you will best grapple with it. Do you have a sense from this feedback? I think this has been really helpful. Do you have a sense of how this could change your question?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you mentioned in the beginning about the why, well, I think both of you were kind of touching on this about why it's going in the direction that it is. Why are they choosing to do this, and why is this the opposite of what the kind of trajectory we're looking for? I mean, I'm glad I have this video, so watch it again, but there's a lot of stuff here.
Thanks, Salmaan.
Thanks.